The World Conspiracy by Nikola Nikolov. What historians do not tell you. Rothschilds. Give me the right to print the money on one country, then I don't care who makes the laws. Rothschild. Nathan, Mayer's third son and founder of the Rothschilds dynasty, was asked by his youngest son how many different nations exist in the world. There are only two you need to think about. Nathan replied, the Jewish family and then there are others. By Jewish family, he means Jewish genus, that is different from other people. The founder of this one-of-a-kind dynasty is Mayer Amschel Rothschild. He was born in 1743 in Frankfurt am Main, Germany. His eldest son Anselm Mayer Rothschild (1773–1855) stays with his father in Frankfurt. The second, Solomon Rothschild (1774–1855), settled in Vienna, Austria. The third, Nathan Mayer (1777–1836), in London. The fourth, Karl Mayer (1788–1855), in Naples, and the fifth, James Mayer (1792–1868), in Paris. The London industry under Nathan Rothschild is the best successful in financial operations and maneuvers. All five brothers play a very important role not only in financial world, but also in the political. If the story should talking about someone, this is the Rothschild dynasty. Starting from the second half of the 18th century and to this day they are financial and the political masters of the world. From 200 years to the present day finance and control all governments in the world. More than the crowned heads are their friends and debtors. Lionel Rothschild was the first Jew to be a member of the English Parliament. His son Nathan Mayer Rothschild in 1885 became the first Jew, per the British Empire. Maurice Rothschild became a member of the French Senate. The great-grandchildren of Mayer Rothschild from the ghetto of Frankfurt, Maine still manages the English financial house, Nathan Mayer Rothschild and Sons. Complete historical data on the personal and commercial life of this ominous family still does not exist. What we have there is an extremely small part of the actual. This is due to the fact that their actions have been preserved for 230 years in complete secrecy and no one can penetrate it. The founder of the Mayer Rothschild dynasty was sent to study for rabbi, but after a short time he entered a Jewish bank house in Hanover as a student, where he studied financial games for a long time. But also there is not much stagnation. He returned to the ghetto of Frankfurt, where his two brothers sell old things and clothes. With them, in a corner of the shop he started his own business with old coins. Many high-ranking figures in Germany and throughout Europe collect old coins. Mayer makes his own numismatic catalogue that sends to famous people, even to local princes. The result is favorable and trade in old coins is fast thrives. Even one day Prince Wilhelm visits him in person. With his servility and with his good manners Mayer does excellently impression of the prince, who became his regular customer. This increases enormously the authority of the poor merchant who begins to play the role of court supplier. He adds to its name, Rothschild, which comes from the little red company of the house. As early as the 16th century the houses of the Jewish quarter of Frankfurt were not numbered. Each door was different from others with some sign or company with a special color. The door of Mayer's house used to have a red sign from which he takes his future surname, Rothschild. Property manager and the prince's wealth is one of his illegitimate sons, Buderus. He befriends Rothschild and begins to exchange foreign currency through him. In 1785 the prince's father died and he inherited his huge riches and titles. The young prince draws an extraordinary big one attention to his army, not only in terms of the military training, but also her dress and neatness. Her clothes ammunition was one of the most beautiful and sophisticated at the time. Many countries have preferred to hire ready-made ones military units and since those of Wilhelm were one of the most renowned, everyone sought to hire them. For example, England kept peace and order in its colonies using the Hessians. Wilhelm from Hesse-Kassel had a huge income from this trade. For every one killed Hesse soldier, the prince received huge extraordinary benefits, who entered the treasury and made him the richest ruler in Europe. Mayer Rothschild skillfully uses the numismatic weakness of the rich prince and began to visit him more and more often in the palace and to him offers more and more interesting old coins, and it is low and acceptable price. It was a tactical move to get closer to the prince as much as possible and to gain his trust. And it's easy to intrigue the other nobles after it is won the trust of the ruler, as it actually happens. Towards the end of 1806, when Napoleon's troops entered Germany, Wilhelm entrusts the storage of his more important documents, archives, jewelry and about $3 million of old Rothschild, which he buries in several different places. These vast treasures possessed by William IX are won in a not very respectable way. This is the moan. This looted money is the basis of the huge Rothschild condition. Since then, no one has been honest earned a dollar in the multi-billion-dollar fortune of the family Rothschild. Obligations of other kings and states to William IX are huge. Mayer's sons travel all over the world, to collect debts. Nathan, the third son of old Rothschild, settles in London and all the prince's assets are concentrated there. Beyond the huge income from Wilhelm's gigantic estate, England paid Rothschild colossal monthly dividends on its capital investment. On the other hand, a secret contract between Wilhelm and Rothschild received some of all collected debts. Napoleon knew that the Hessian ruler possessed vast riches and in every way sought to obtain them. There are whole regiments dug into his palaces and even Rothschild's house and shop, but they found nothing, as everything had already been sent to London. Only buried jewelry disappears in a mysterious way. Mayer Rothschild traveled several times to Denmark, where the prince was in exile, explaining to him how he and she had been harassed his sons by the Napoleonic authorities who suspected them. He constantly assured the prince that he would get all the money until the last penny. Meanwhile, Nathan, having these enormous wealth, uses the critical military situation in Europe and shortages of goods. Buys all kinds of goods, cotton works, coffee, tobacco and others, which he imports on a regular or smuggled way to the hungry markets in Germany, the Scandinavian countries and even in France. So Wilhelm's money tenfold thanks to the Rothschilds, who can now return it to him money to the penny. From 1810 until today, the Rothschild Company no longer deals with purchase and sale of goods, and only purchase and sale of money. The first serious deal of this kind is the purchase of 400 tons gold from the famous East India Company. From this Rothschild earns 4 times more than he invested. The same gold Nathan immediately sold to the English state to maintain the Wellington campaign. Towards the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the British Empire subsidized most of its allies countries such as Russia, Austria and Prussia. The biggest problem, however, is how to move amounts. No big company has been enabled to bear the risk of transporting such large sums or so much gold. Only Nathan and his brothers are hired to do so, this, operating from its various bases with cipher correspondence and with the fastest couriers and pigeons at the time. The large sums that personally owned, give them the opportunity to find branches in Paris, Vienna, Berlin and Naples. Each of the brothers is responsible for a separate branch. In this way, Mayer and Sons create among themselves the first largest international clearinghouse. After Napoleon, construction began to rise in Europe, culture and art, which requires large material resources, hence many loans. Most of the European governments prefer to take from smaller bankers, avoiding financial colossus Rothschild. The main reason for this is their crude materialism and their clumsiness. At that time all sorts of salons in France, Germany and Austria are also thriving on everyday topics: poetry, art and culture or conversation. The Rothschild brothers are alien to this spirit. Absorbed entirely by material and financial deals, they do not have time to study in the salon cavalry, which at that time it was at the center of secular life. They don't even know they dance, which is why they are not accepted in high society. A lot they were well aware of what they were missing and that it was too late to acquire. But the Rothschilds decided to use their financial power to the winner's win. In 1818 the French government bonds from a famous loan in 1817 they began to decline very rapidly after 1 year constant uploading, which entails other securities. This is not happening only in Paris, but throughout Europe, where stock markets are collapsing. The brothers, holders of countless bonds from around the world, in silence buy most of the competing bonds and at one point them sell out all over Europe at once, which provokes financial moaning. Now the whole world understands that Rothschild should not be ignored, and all politicians in Europe are starting to compete over who to take bigger loan from them. Salons and high society no more notice their clumsiness. This is probably the beginning of their political triumph. The owner of these innumerable riches, the old Jew from the ghetto of Frankfurt, creates several basic principles for their management and protection. His will is strict and intolerant, no changes or deviations. His 5 sons as well his whole generation are obliged to observe it. The sanctions are many, strict and irrevocable. 1. The eldest to be the head and manager of the whole estate. This is the principle of seniority, which does not exclude the promotion of more capable, but only by choice of all members of the family. 2. Marriages in the family itself, between cousins. The goal is to keep all the treasures and nothing to come out of the family. This rule is not strictly followed as another factor arises. Many Jews, meanwhile, became quite wealthy. Marriage not only is not lost, but on the contrary, the condition increases. As a biological consequence of these one-blooded marriages, the birth rate is low. Most of the children are girls, among whom there are also mentally retarded. 3. Preservation of wealth, united and indivisible, as they are unto this day. 4. The will of old Mayor Rothschild in no case. Yes, it is not shown to the public and is not made available to any historian. 5. All heirs and generations of the family to be always loyal to the old Jewish faith. 6. Do not make any public inventory and do not conduct inheritance cases and the like between the members of the family. All who do not observe the above are deprived of heritage. 7. The whole condition, which in no case and under no circumstances pretext should not be divided, to be governed forever only by male line, between family members, and be partners. Women, family members, and their husbands do not right to participate in the management of the company. Each of heirs who protests or opposes the above rules, automatically loses his right to inherit. It seems that the old Mayor Anselm, who was a lot religious, aimed to establish the power of a Jewish dynasty through their male heirs. His will to this day not only valid for his dynasty, but for all Jews in the world. It is assumed that his will was made with the help of both Hasidim, Jacob Joseph and Jacob Isaac. He believes in religion enthusiasm that the Jews are a chosen people, and that the Lord has promised them to rule the world. I have not met a Jew who does not believe in this. That is seen not only from the protocols of the sages of Zion, but also from everything that is happening in the world today. Meir is a Hasidim, that is to say worshipper and follower of Hasidism, the most pious movement in Judaism, which originated in southeastern Poland in the 18th century. This doctrine presents Israel as a cosmic factor, such as focal point of the creation of the world. Hasidism is developing and perfected by Jacob Joseph and Jacob Isaac, both contemporaries of the first Rothschild. The established Jacobin clubs in France, England, Italy and elsewhere, they take their name from these two Jewish religious figures. Theodor Herzl, a personal friend of Lord Rothschild and founder of modern Zionism, around 1897 founded two very important organizations that still play a leading role in the world. One is extremely secret, it includes 300 people whose identity is kept in complete secrecy, and represents the supreme management of the Jewish race. The second is folk religious, an organization of 450 Jewish representatives, churches and rabbis. The Rothschild dynasty began with Meir's 5 sons. Amschel. Nathan Rothschild is the most clumsy and unscrupulous of all brothers. For him, the only guiding factor is dynastic logic. He has a rare exploitative mind and perseverance for success. For him, Disraeli, he says, he was the master and teacher of world markets and therefore the master and teacher of everything else. His successes are mainly due to the secrecy and perseverance with which he worked. This has been and is the most important principle of governance and success all the Rothschilds to this day. Once someone who polished his shoes asked him why his tip is smaller than his son's. He replied, "The boy's father is a millionaire. It's not mine." Otherwise, when a merchant offered him a good picture, Nathan told him, "Give me a picture for £30. I don't care which one. Goodbye." Sometimes he also showed arrogance inherent in her omnipotence, the omnipotent. For example, at a ball at the Duke of Wellington, another Duke named Montmorency spoke enthusiastically of his own predecessors. "So you are the first Christian baron," he said. Nathan said in front of everyone out loud, "I'm the first. The Jewish baron, which is more interesting, but I don't flaunt it." After Nathan's death, by decision of the 4 other brothers, the family scepter was given to Baron James, the youngest of the 5 brothers, based in Paris. Unlike the biggest brother Nathan, the fame of James was carried in the most famous French salons. Always elegantly dressed, the red-haired young man is extraordinary, quickly and imperceptibly enters the most sophisticated circles of Paris. On the 29th-year-old became Consul General of the Austrian Empire in Paris. Buys one of the most beautiful palaces in Paris, Palace Fouché. He married his niece Betty, his brother's daughter Solomon of Vienna, for whom Heinrich Heine wrote the poem The Angel. In a very short time, Rossini became his close friends, Heine, Honoré de Balzac, Georges Sand, Delacroix. Takes part in the overthrow and ascent of all French kings after Napoleon. I will dwell on an interesting incident. The famous artist Delacroix offered him to paint it as the beggar and James accept. The next morning he goes disguised in begging for clothes and calling Delacroix's studio. Opens one of his disciples, and seeing the wretched beggar, put a franc in him hand and expels him. The next day a servant dressed in livery conveys to the student the following letter: Dear Sir, I will find in the envelope 1 franc you gave me at the door of Mr. Delacroix's studio, with an interest of 10,000 francs. You can redeem the check in my bank whenever you want. James de Rothschild. Heine very often visits James Rothschild in his office and with interest observes its visitors and their servility, about which this great poet and satirist concludes, Here we see how small man is and how great God is. James Rothschild financed the Bourbons through Spanish Civil War 1820, for which he received a high award, the Legion of Honor. In 1830, the ruler Charles X collapses and Louis-Philippe comes to power. To everyone's surprise, he turns out to be a very close friend of Rothschild, who immediately gets up financial advisor to the new king, and the brothers gain a monopoly on government loans. On February 24, 1848, the king left Paris and fled. The crowd he began to demolish the royal palaces and set fire to the villas of the rich. James gave 250,000 francs to the Minister of the Interior of the Revolution, for patriotic purposes. The very next day after his escaped friend of the king, James wrote a letter to the provisional government, which at the same time published it in the press. He, James Rothschild, proposes to give 50,000 francs to those wounded in street fighting. And like some magician escapes from the disadvantage, and only in a few weeks he is back on top. Even the most fanatical Republicans conclude that it is one of the most necessary for the Republic. His fortunes at that time exceeded 600 million francs. Solomon Rothschild (1774–1955) fell at this time in anti-Semitic Austria, where Jews are not allowed to own property, practice law, be judges, teachers, yes, engage in politics or participate in governance. Although all these restrictions over time, like his brother, he succeeds through a variety of financial maneuvers and tricks to win friends like the dictator Metternich and even the emperor himself. Unlike his other brothers, he prospered in Austria to a great extent thanks to his diplomacy. The conditions under which it begins are much heavier than his brothers. He hires one first hotel room, because, as I said above, cannot own property. Then he rents more rooms, a whole floor, and a little later, a hotel. He first started with his own company. While the rulers are recover, granted the Austrian state a loan of 55 million guilder, such as has never been received before. Not after for a long time he issued bonds for 35 million guilders. All who are bought from them, they win, and most of all, Solomon. In 1825's very complex financial maneuvers he financed Maria Louisa, wife of the exiled Napoleon and daughter of the Austrian emperor. Napoleon's 2 children by Maria Louisa, due to the fast-growing events, have not been officially registered as his. Grandpa, the Austrian emperor, assumes their protection and with the help of Solomon Rothschild secures their future. After the death of the emperor, his ascended the throne son Ferdinand, who due to his mental condition was not capable of governing the country. However, thanks to a healthy hand of Metternich and his best and closest friend Solomon Rothschild, Austria continues to flourish. In February 1848 in France became turbulent and Louis-Philippe fell from the throne, which immediately reflected in Austria. Metternich avoids in Frankfurt, protected by the Rothschilds. Solomon a few months later he leaves the country never to return to it. Karl Rothschild (1788–1855). His real name was Kalman, the family nickname Mezuzah. He was a little different from the brothers, due to which he did not receive any until he was 35 years old independent work. His main job was to organize and manage the courier service, which was crucial for the success of the dynasty. In 1821, the Kingdom of Bourbon was legalized in Naples. In this connection, Austria asked the Rothschilds to deal with the military subsidies. The brothers send Kalman, a person no one knows Europe. Here he takes the name Karl. His brother from Austria advanced a loan from Naples, which was to be covered by the costs of the Austrian occupation. In 1827, Karl's newly opened Bank Naples is the institute that officially pays the troops that support the king in power. Karl starts playing just like his brother's important political role. He funded most of the dukes of Italy. Despite his brother Solomon's close friendship with the old Chancellor Metternich, Karl is the one who prepares his falling and leaving Austria to replace him with another younger one. He revives little of the papal estates, despite its own and the family's organic hatred of the Vatican. But everything is for a purpose, he wants a formal promise from the Vatican to correct its anti-Jewish policy. It was adopted by Pope Gregory XVI, and unlike everyone else, the Pope extends his hand to kiss her, instead of the big toe, as was customary. Amschel Rothschild (1773–1855), Mayer's eldest son. After the death of his father is inherited by the Frankfurt Bank, where he has worked with him. Strongly religious and a deep believer in the Talmud, he spent a lot of time in the synagogue praying to the Lord to give him a son, which is never born to him. He is radically different from his brother's character. Until the last day of his life he lived modestly and sensibly. He did not have palaces like the other brothers, he dresses in old age, see his Jewish black clothes. Spends a lot of money on charitable purposes. Despite not very comfortable living in Frankfurt, he remained there for the rest of his life. Keeps excellent relationship with the son of Prince Wilhelm, from whom the family profited your condition. While they were indebted to their father for years, now his son is indebted to them. He has close ties with most of European rulers and kings. He became very close friends with Otto von Bismarck, legendary Chancellor of Germany. Although anti-Semitic sentiment in Germany, he has always managed to deal with the crowds. His house was once surrounded by rage anti-Semitic mob. Instead of hiding, he goes out on the balcony and he begins to speak to them. Dear friends, you want money from the richer Jew. There are 40 million Germans. I have so much florina. Like I will cast one for each of you. The crowd held out their hands, he grabs the money and disperses. Everyone has characterized it as a peculiar and old-fashioned eccentric. The mother of 5 brothers, Gudula Rothschild, lived to be 96. Year of age in the same house with the Red Company where she lived with her husband Mayer Rothschild. In these turbulent times many of Gudula's neighbors ask her if she has heard anything from her sons. Will there be peace or war? She always answers, my sons, they will not allow war. From what you will read in the following pages, you will decide for yourself which of the two words, peace or war, is more appropriate to ascribe to sons and their generations. According to data from the Jewish Encyclopedia, all the Napoleonic Wars were funded by them, and at the same time the Rothschilds also provide material support for the Allies. They do the same during the American Revolution and the Civil War. They are Clemenceau and Wilson's chief advisors on the Treaty of Versailles, which is one of the main causes of World War II. No one is able to determine the riches of this dynasty. In 1925, Russian General Skull-Spiridovich them estimated at $300 billion, separately from their revenue. According to him, the First World War was $100 billion. Others they think there are many more. The Rothschilds through their agents own 4/5 of the wealth of Europe and almost all of America. USA owes several trillion dollars. Whom? Of course, to them, to banks and the Federal Reserve, which prints banknotes. Already in the last century the famous German writer Ludwig Bjorn writes, won't it be the greatest blessing in the world, if all kings are banished and on their thrones put the Rothschild family? Just think what will be the benefits. The new dynasty will never take a loan because he knows better than anyone else what amounts must be paid against this loan. Bribery of ministers and rulers will stop because no one will. There are so many funds to bribe a Rothschild. About 100 years after the founding of Rothschild and Sons, they became the main bankers of empires and continents, of the whole Europe, Russia and America. Only their London branch at the time has lent more than $7,000 million. You can imagine how much they gained from interest. One very important factor for their success is theirs extremely well-organized intelligence and courier service, much more efficient than similar services in other countries. A lot from kings send confidential mail through their couriers so as they did not trust their own government officials. At that time, around 1839, the interests of the company dictated peace in Europe, as not everyone is still armed. And the Rothschilds state openly, if Austria takes military action against France, we, the branch in England, will join France, and conversely, if France takes military action against Austria, we will join Austria. In 1839, King Leopold of Belgium was ready to annex with force the provinces of Luxembourg and Limburg. Solomon of Vienna, the Rothschild branch, openly states, in this situation, Yours Majesty will not receive a penny from us and Belgium is needed alone. The king surrendered to Rothschild and received a loan. Heine calls the 5 brothers great revolutionaries. No one before them he had failed to usurp feudalism. Aren't they the ones who removed the rigidity of land tenure? No, are they the ones who invented government bonds that anyone can to own? All these ways of borrowing and paper money circulation are invented by them. Aren't the Rothschilds archdemons of progress? The construction of railways in Europe is exclusively their work. An example of this is the Vienna project Galicia, about 96 kilometers long, valued at 12,000 guilders, which the Rothschilds are issuing in the form of shares, of which 8,000 are reserved for themselves, and 4,000 sell. The construction of the first railways in Europe meets very strong opposition from scientists, doctors and the press, who claim that the human respiratory system cannot withstand at a speed of 25 km per hour, and also that such a speed will cause bleeding from the nose, mouth and ears and lead people to mental disorders, uncontrollability and suicide. The truth is that the passengers did not faint while the actions took place uploaded without any control. The French railways were built in the same way: Paris, Saint-Germain, Paris-Versailles and the Northern Railway. This brings on the French Rothschild house very high income and at the same time gives a strong impetus to the fast-growing industry. The first founders of the most powerful dynasty in the world began to leave earthly life. In 1836, Nathan of London died house. In 1855 he buried three more of the brothers, Charles of Naples, Solomon of Vienna and Amschel of Frankfurt. Those who work together and create with great efforts the enormous wealth and authority, they die almost simultaneously. The death of the founding brothers not only did not lead the Rothschild family to decline, but on the contrary, it can be said that from here her great successes and conquests began. From here then their power, expressed in unwavering and iron consistency, a continuation of the covenant of Patriarch Meir. His will, which remains to this day hidden from the world, is strictly enforced by the heirs for whom it is more than the Talmud. Old Meir manages to create the strongest a weapon of success called sons. Each Rothschild generation and to this day he uncompromisingly fulfills his calling. His generations are beginning to speak not only the pure language of the country, see which they live, but also the language of the nobles and the respective royal yard. There is no accent from the Frankfurt ghetto. The Rothschild dynasty is considered the royal dynasty of the Jews and rightly so, because to this day no one has helped the Jewish race as much as they do. Ever since the creation of the family extremely great attention is paid to education and religion of the younger generations. In each of them a branch to the youth is attached to a rabbi who was engaged in the religious and Hebrew training of the family. At the same time in most European countries there are many restrictions on attitude of the Jews. However, most of these restrictions do not affect the Rothschild clan. There have been, albeit very rare, cases where they themselves had to work hard to overcome the old one's conservative laws. For example, Lionel Nathan Mayer was elected 6 times in the English Parliament and as soon as it reaches the Bible and to the oath was rejected because he wanted to take the oath only before the ancient Jewish Talmud. His perseverance lasted for years until finally, with the help of Disraeli, a baptized Jew, Prime Minister of England, the old laws of Britain and Rothschild became a Member of Parliament, wherefore he has not spoken or manifested for 15 years any activity. Throughout this long-running election struggle and a lot of money that arrives in the most remote corner of the British Empire, his name became the most popular after that of the Queen. Significantly, even the most conservative British retreat before the power and might of gold. After funding the Suez Canal, the Queen of Great Britain honors Lionel's son Nathaniel Rothschild with the title of peer that he accepts by swearing to everyone ancient Jewish rituals. The third generation of Rothschilds in England are the 3 sons of Lionel, called the Zion Trio. She inherits not only the Bank of London, but also all the huge family wealth in Great Britain. No one before them, as well as after them, was so rich. Unlike the grandfather Nathan, a liberal by understanding, the grandchildren of the trio stand out as extremely conservative and supporters of the aristocracy. The whole world rightly calls them kings of Jews, because they have done much more for the Jews of the world than any Jewish king. Jewish schools are all funded and maintained by them, all costs thousands. Emigrants from Russia and other countries were taken over by the Rothschilds. If somewhere repression began against the Jews, the Rothschilds immediately intervene and suspend any loans to this country until persecution is not abolished. There are several such cases with the royal Russia. For them, Jews and theirs are always in the first place ancient Hebrew religion. They, the owners of better and more expensive palaces of kings, live in indescribable splendor, but very often requires them to surrender their personal desires and understandings to religious. For example, despite his weakness for Renaissance fine art did not have his works in their palaces only because of their religious content. In France after the 1980s and 1990s, political struggles and revolutions, Bourbons, Orleans and Bonapartists have been dethroned, while the Rothschilds with their representative Baron Alphonse continue to hold the scepter firmly. Alphonse Rothschild, one of the true representatives of the ghetto, lives in France during quite severe events, the fall of Louis Napoleon and the tumultuous birth of the Third Republic. He always is in the right place at all times with your people behind the scenes, ready for action. European kings and statesmen in the most critical moments used the mediation of the family and its channels of communication and information. In 1870 the Germans' troops entered France and Bismarck with the famous General Moltke established their headquarters and command in one of the palaces of Rothschild. Bismarck, seeing these perfectly arranged properties, gardens and parks, openly admits, kings can't afford this luxury, it can only belong to Rothschild. Bismarck chooses a simple bedroom, like a private bedroom the baron owner leaves intact. And not only that, he orders his subordinates not to touch the precious one's ornaments, as well as fruits and flowers in the parks. Himself Bismarck was ordered to limit his hunting and killing of animals in the parks of Rothschild. For a large reward, Bismarck forced the governor to the palace to sell him a case of wine, for which the governor makes written report to his master in Paris. The document is kept today in the palace. I highlight all these incidents so that the reader can imagine the power and authority of this dynasty. At a time when all of Europe worshipped Bismarck, he himself had to fight for your wine. This is the power of money. They always have been omnipotent and will be. The creation of today's Israel is closely linked to the dynasty Rothschilds. As early as 1882, Edmund Rothschild, whose seat was in Paris, began funding the settlement of exactly 101 Russian Jews near Jaffa. And he not only finances them, but creates many others such Jewish colonies in Palestine. Buys land from the Arabs and whole neighborhoods of nicer houses in Jerusalem that he inhabits with Polish and Russian Jews. Most of the 100 such Jewish colonies they begin to bloom and develop. Edmund doesn't just provide for them introduction of agricultural crops, but also buys the whole for years their production at higher prices than the market. Quite rightly Theodor Herz, the founder of the Zionist movement, says, the family is the most effective force that our people have acquired after the scattering. In 1887, Emperor Franz Joseph with a special and imperial decree declared the Rothschilds aristocrats, though are not of 4 generations descendants of the highest nobles and they are not baptized. Due to bloody intermarriage after a few generations degeneration occurs. The male generation is beginning to disappear or some of them are born disabled. Most are heirs girls. This, as well as some political events, became the reason to close the 2 branches, in Italy and the main one in Frankfurt. 3 Rothschild divisions remained, in England, France and Austria. Until 1918 they functioned very well, but after that year everything in the world is changing, thinking and ideas are different. The world is going to socialism. Fees and taxes are rising tremendously a lot. It becomes simply impossible to live like Rothschild. To everyone these expensive castles and huge mansions taxes are getting so high, that they have been swallowed up for several years. On the other hand, immediately after the First World War spread anti-Semitism mood. Exactly when is unknown, but between 1920 to 1930. The Rothschild family decides to scatter their capital in their hands of more banks and companies, so that the name Rothschild no longer stands out. In Europe has only 2 branches left, Paris and London, which are still celebrated as one of the richest banks in the world. For the most part their condition is currently in the United States, where he is very cleverly disguised behind hundreds of smaller names, companies and banks. There are very few today people who know the true owner of the world and wealth mu. The former Rothschild dynasty is now more powerful than ever, holds in its hands all the financial and political power in the world. During the German occupation of Austria, France and most of Europe some of the Rothschild family are detained by the Gestapo and released in many mysterious ways. The famous Baron Louis, leader and owner of the Austrian Bank, stands in Vienna despite warnings from Paris. Still on the day after Anschluss he was arrested and taken to the Gestapo. Not after has long been personally visited by Himmler, who wonders if he is abused and offered him cigarettes. After a short conversation with Himmler Baron Louis Rothschild was released, went to Switzerland and from there to the United States, whose subject it is. At the same time, there are thousands of other Jews persecuted, lynched and killed by this same Himmler. For Rothschild new life in America is not as difficult as it is for millions other immigrants. Here, too, he is already the master of banks and capital. Many companies, working under other names, such as Morgan, Kuhn, Loeb, Wartburg and others were under its branches. Some of the underground railways also belong to him. During Hitler's occupation of France with a special order of the Führer all Rothschild collections amounting to hundreds of millions of dollars have been carefully moved to Bavaria in one castle in the Alps. Immediately after the war in 1945, all of these masterpieces, one of which is Rubens's Three Graces, have been returned inventory of Rothschild owners. One of the main successes of this family is realized: the 5 sons of the old mayor, scattered throughout Europe and covered its main points, Frankfurt, Vienna, London, Paris and Italy. they use very rationally the so-called balance of power. If a statesman refuses to repay his obligations or to conclude government loan with them, they immediately apply political blackmail, such as offer a large and profitable loan to the enemy state, which armament begins. In this way they keep constantly European countries against each other under the threat of war. By financing both countries, they make huge profits such a dishonest way. They used the victory of the English general very dishonestly Wellington over Napoleon at Waterloo to lay hands on the English government. Through its well-organized courier service they realize 2 days before each other that Napoleon has lost. On the famous Nathan Rothschild with a sad face begins to sell English government bonds, which is a signal for other companies and banks. Panic ensues and everyone sells English government bonds that fall in just a few hours. Incredible. At the same time, Nathan's agents are secretly buying them. On the next day, when the official news arrives that England is winning paint at Waterloo, the Rothschilds own most of the bonds of England. This is their crown number with which they are undisturbed by no one is in a position to own more than England, France, Europe, America, but also the whole world. It is interesting to know something about the people who lead their branches in America. The Wartburgs were considered the second most famous and international banking family in the 19th century. The embryo theirs is Abraham del Banco of Venice. His sons moved to Hamburg, Germany, and changed their name to Wartburg. As early as 1814 the Wartburg family became a branch of the Rothschilds. Most remarkable of the surnames are the two brothers Paul and Max, whom I want to dwell on. Max was the one who financed Germany during the First World War and later the Nazi regime. The same in 1918 was director of espionage in Germany. Everyone has heard of the Nazi persecution of the Jews in Germany, while the Max Wartburg firm and its members were not affected. Wartburg himself is officially leaving for the United States. Pavel Wartburg is the founder of the German industrial giant IG Farben and Agfa Film. He became an American citizen and plays a very important role in the financial enslavement of the United States with the creation of the Federal Reserve. He represents the United States at the Versailles Peace Conference, while his brother Max defended German interests. We all know how unfair it is, the Treaty of Versailles with the 14 Wilson points, as well as the consequences of this treaty, the coming to power of Hitler and World War II war. The brothers did a very good job, not regretting it. Several million of his compatriots killed by Hitler. Pavel Wartburg, personally awarded by the German Kaiser, is preparing the Bolshevik Revolution, handing over sums to Lenin and Trotsky, collected by German bankers. It is believed that the richest in America are the financial houses of Rockefeller, Ford and Carnegie, and in fact they are richer very far from Rothschild. According to General Spiridovich, the fortune of the Rothschild branches in 1925 was $300 billion plus $100 billion earned from the First World War. Add to that their income from the American Depression of 1929 and the volatile stock exchange until 1936, the family owned more than $500 billion, which is twice the value of the wealth of the entire population of the United States. Apart from Rothschild, the world has existed and still exists very wealthy Jewish families who on the same exploitative and unscrupulous way accumulate incredible wealth at the expense of millions of naive people. In the same way as the five brothers the Rothschilds control Europe, they are currently financing and managing most of all these smaller companies, which under the auspices of the boss, are included in the Gang of 300, now ruling not only Europe but and the whole world. Many sins weigh on the conscience of this sinister dynasty. They managed to impose their money on all Jews and the 30th century a secret Masonic organization to recognize them as absolute masters. Freemasonry organizations are the ones that carry out repression and assassinations of inconvenient persons, rulers and rulers. Neither great triumph is the defeat of Napoleon, achieved again by Masonic organizations. Then they had to deal with Russian Tsar Alexander Romanov, the Habsburgs and the Hohenzollerns, who in 1815 concluded the so-called Sacred Union, League of Nations for promotion of Christianity. This is the main reason why the Rothschilds spoke out against these three dynasties. For this purpose created many capable agents such as Disraeli 1805, Napoleon III 1808, Bismarck 1815, Gambetta 1838, Marshal Soult, first assistant to Napoleon, Karl Marx, Hertz, Trotsky and many more others. Object 1 is the Russian Tsar Alexander Romanov, who tirelessly seeks to unite the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches, as well as to conclude an Anglo-Russian alliance and thus save the world from unnecessary wars and constant clashes. Here he plays the villain role, their agent, the baptized Jew Disraeli, who thwarts union. Disraeli's quick climb surprises everyone, except the quality of high self-confidence, has nothing else, nor is it rich, nor has any qualifications or special intellect. For on the other hand, even as a young man he was chosen, prepared and launched by Lionel Rothschild for the implementation of the special plan for the world domination. From 1814 to 1848 the supreme command of world secrets organizations is Alta Vendetta, the highest lodge of the Italians Freemasons with a Grand Master, apparently one of the Rothschilds. After destroying Napoleon, they need another the same scale and create it, Bismarck, who, like Disraeli he was neither an able nor a good student. He leads a lavish life, which he does leads to large material obligations. According to the General Spiridovich, Otto Bismarck was the illegitimate son of Marshal Soult, who he is also a Jew. The peaceful and Christian religious policy of Alexander I is the exact opposite of that of the family. The reconciliation of the two churches, the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox, would be a terrible defeat for those whose religion recognizes only the Talmud. The fatal mistake of Alexander is that he underestimates this all-powerful secret organization. The same the Americans and the Soviet Union are making a mistake today. Alexander I communicated not only with Christians but also with Jews and Muslims. After lunch, he went to a Jewish synagogue. He felt ill and died on December 1, 1825, after great anguish. Doctors found that he was poisoned with the known slow-acting aqua tofana poison. The main reason for the murder and liquidation of the latter 6 Russian Tsars of the Romanov dynasty is not to give in to any case opportunity of the Eastern Orthodox faith to reconcile with Catholic and come to the creation of a powerful universal church. After they ruled France, Germany, Austria, England, the United States and Russia, make your own conclusions. Who is the world emperor? The huge capital they have extends to attaches like a leech to every human endeavor and effort. The loans granted to the various countries bring them enormous benefits, big profits, which naturally have a negative impact on life of the population. For example, in 1818 the Rothschilds granted Prussia a £5 million loan against which Prussia received only £3.5 million, and the rest £1.5 million plus 7% interest received by Rothschild in just a few years. Through in 1823, they took on all of France's loans on devastating terms for her, at more than 50% interest. In fact, their profits from these government loans are unlimited. With them, they guarantee the state bonds and stocks they play with as they wish. They take them down, raise at their discretion, as they are the ones who rule and manipulate world stock markets. In his book, Jews and Modern Capitalism, Professor Werner Sombart writes, in the period from 1820 onwards the Rothschild century, so that by the middle of the century in general opinion was that there is only one power in Europe and that is Rothschild, Disraeli, which is a 100% function of Lionel Nathan Rothschild, in his books Cunningham, describes the Rothschilds, the character theirs and their power like no other. However, he is nowhere to be found mentions names, only pseudonyms. For 75 years the readers of Disraeli's short stories think that names were invented while in 1921, the Russian author Skull Spiridovich discovered that under the name Lionel Rothschild is hiding in Sidonia. In his book, Disraeli writes, he was the master of the market, trade and money of the whole world and of course, master of everything else. He actually has all the income of southern Italy through Karl Rothschild in Naples. Monarchs and ministers from all countries court and receive him his advice. Cunninghorst, pp. 213 and 214. Sidonia, Lionel Rothschild, has no heart, he was a man without any feeling towards other people. 6. In his same book, published in 1844, Disraeli confirms that Lionel Rothschild knew in advance about Revolution of 1848 and that it was prepared in Germany by the Jesuits with whom the family was closely associated. In 1815 they liquidated Napoleon I and then Nathan removes all 3 very famous dynasties Hohenzollern, Habsburg and Novels. Immediately after the poisoning of Alexander I in 1825, they try to revolutionize Russia, but fail. In 1831 they kill both sons of Napoleon. In 1853, their pawns Disraeli, Bismarck and the illegitimate son of Nathan Rothschild, Napoleon III, provoke the Crimean War and as they failed to win it, they poisoned Nicholas I in 1855. As I pointed out before, they managed to create personalities that play a very big role in the history of the world. We are all fine it is known what a colossal role they play in the history of mankind. Karl Marx, Hertz, Lassalle, Bombles, Disraeli, Bismarck, Gambetta, Kerensky, Trotsky, Lenin, Venizelos, Masaryk and others. The Masonic Congress in Wilhelmsbad decided the three monarchs were liquidated: Louis XVI, Gustav III and Joseph II, and they were liquidated as follows: Gustav III 1790, the Austrian monarch Joseph II 1792 and Louis XVI 1793. Let us not forget that the Masonic lodges were in complete obedience of Rothschild and unconditionally carry out their orders. Their intrigues are becoming known throughout Europe, but no one is enabled to stop them. He who tries perishes. In 1848, 18-year-old Franz Joseph became Austrian emperor, but in fact the state was ruled by his tutor Bombles, who strictly obeys the orders of Rothschild and strives in every way to spoil relations between Austria and Russia. On the other hand, Nathan in England is trying to turn the country against France, whence his brother James did his best to help him provoke war between these friendly countries. James orders of the Freemasons to join the Bonapartists, the Orleans, the Republicans and to overthrow King Charles X of Bourbon, who was famous for his religious Christian beliefs. Their intrigues managed to trick France into attacking Algeria, which set England against France and led to the fall of Charles X. The French revolutions, which are exclusively their work, bring the Rothschilds to unprecedented power, material and political. Their influence and control over the fate of European countries is sealed in world history. It's the 19th century, remarkable with the construction of railways, 90% of which are funded by the Rothschilds. From his deal with France for delivery on rails and wagons, James Rothschild received about 700 million francs. The kings of the stock exchanges, as they were then called, made their living 150 to 200 million a year in a dishonest way. Through the press, which then and now belongs to them more than 90%, manipulate not only departments and banks, but also the general public. Artificially created financial panics annually bring them fabulous profits, at the expense of bankrupt ordinary working people. At that time, the British distrusted her Jews. Greedy Nathan Rothschild decides to be baptized for the sole purpose, accumulation of even more wealth. For this unscrupulousness pays with his life. His brothers, faithful to the faith and testament of his father, condemned and poisoned him, and to protect his son Lionel from baptism, he married the daughter of his uncle Karl Rothschild. Lionel's teacher and educator became Bombles, a Jew who he accepted the Catholic faith and became a Jesuit. The same Bombles later marries Napoleon's second wife. It is worth noting that in the Rothschild dynasty had almost no open discontent and intrigues by numerous members, and if there were, they were kept in top secret. Perhaps they have contributed to this obedience the penalties provided for in the will of the first Rothschild, which were more than draconian. We saw that Nathan, though his incredible power, for infidelity and apostasy from the will of the founder of the family pays with his life. James Nathan rebelled against the tyranny of Alphonse Rothschild IV and him found with a slit throat. The same thing happens with Lionel's grandson, Nathaniel Rothschild IV, who was also found in London with a cut throat. It seems that this was the family method of execution maintained obedience and order in the dynasty. All the great world figures of the last 2 centuries, left their names in history, they were nothing but true and obedient executors of the orders of the great clan, which many skillfully uses their mind, abilities and qualities to accomplish of their personal interests and aspirations. Disraeli is the right hand of Lionel Rothschild in England, the Jesuit Weishaupt, Illuminati, Amschel in Germany, Gambetta with his remarkable speeches and later as Minister of the Interior of France immaculately pursued the policy of James Rothschild III. Poincaré, 5 times Prime Minister of France and President of the Third Republic, served faithfully to Alphonse for the rest of his life. Rothschild FOORTH and Edward Rothschild V. Kerensky as Prime Minister of the Provisional Russian Government plays an essential role in establishing Bolshevism in Russia, faithful and accurate to the plans of Rothschild v. Both Weishaupt and Bombles and Disraeli, by order of Rothschild adopted the pro forma Christian faith to make it easier to launch and carry out the infernal plans of the Hidden Hand. Venizelos maliciously and deliberately provokes the Greek-the-Turkish war to defeat Tsar Constantine, with which he carried out the Rothschild plans. The mysterious assassination of the Greek king Alexander I is also attributed to this omnipotent organization. When President Lincoln is trying to break away from the political and financial dependence of the Rothschilds, they did not hesitate to do so. Liquidate. Honest U.S. President Garfield, too, he pays with his life for his courage to say, who control the money of a nation, control that nation. Disraeli himself admits in his book Cunningham's Rothschild Finances and supports all revolutionaries in the world, a confession that very ugly denounces the Rothschild dynasty in maintaining strife and unrest. If the Actors of Cunninghorse was deciphered while Disraeli was the author alive, despite his great merits, the descendants of Lionel Rothschild would not be forgiven and hesitated to do so the familial way of execution, cutting the throat. It is noteworthy that the conservative British show a lot greater resistance from the Rothschilds than from the French. James Rothschild's receptions are more lavish than those of the royal court. It was much harder to be invited to the palace of Rothschild than in the palace of the king. The famous Italian patriot Giuseppe Mazzini, an ally of Garibaldi, writes, "The golden calf is omnipotent in France, and he, James Rothschild, could become king if he wished." The Russian revolutionary Herzen, illegitimate son of Hertz from the Rothschild family, glorifies in the Russian newspaper Bell Rothschild and calls them kings. He is an ardent revolutionary and enemy of Emperor Nicholas I. This is the same Herzen, the idol of Bolshevism. Karl Marx, the greatest agitator against capitalism, nowhere does he mention the name of the Rothschilds. This is mysterious. Isn't silence telling us something? As strange as it may seem to the reader, the bare truth is that these well-known personalities and gods for the communist world are supported materially and morally by the capitalist dynasty they serve devotedly. All revolutions, uprisings and riots are organized and up-organized by secret backstage organizations, guided by socialists, and are implemented by the working class, which has always been and will be the scapegoat. Who is the leader of these secret organizations that prepare the revolution in France in 1848? Without a doubt, James Rothschild, as Disraeli himself acknowledges. Where are the workers during the revolution in France? Of course, on the barricades and around the guillotine, they call death, without even to know whose head will fall into the trash. The same mass of workers is not allowed to the meetings at which important ones are taken decisions, and are implemented on their behalf. Their methods are the same for the French Revolution. Nicholas I's ardent desire was peaceful coexistence with England and France, which proved impossible due to the strong influence of and Rothschild power in these countries. His plan is to be released Bulgaria and Serbia from the Turkish yoke, in exchange for leaving England to own Egypt. For this noble purpose he pays with your life. He was poisoned by his own doctor, Mand, bribed by the omnipotent hidden hand. In 1855 came to power Alexander II, the liberator of the peasants and the savior of the United States. We already know how these European powers, Germany, France, England, Austria and Italy, are divided and fall under the rule of the five Rothschild brothers. The United States and Russia remain. Honest, the presidents of the United States are struggling not to fall under the tutelage of this sinister dynasty. But one after another they happen liquidated. Every president who opposed them was killed. Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley and Harding were killed by payers killers of the 300. Since 1912, with the election of Wilson as President of the United States, the tragedy of America begins, and it continues to this day be the tragedy of the whole world tomorrow. Nobody needs the Crimean War, which is well known. The Rothschilds almost ruined England and France, and Europe became poorer at the expense of only a handful of favored people. When England, France, Prussia, Sweden and Sardinia are ready to help Turkey retain power over the occupied countries, Alexander II was the only European ruler, crowned head, determined to liberate Christian nations from a 500-year-old Turkish yoke. After the Rothschilds killed Tsar Nicholas I, through Disraeli provide England, France, through Napoleon III, Germany, through Bismarck and Italy, through Mazzini, remain the United States planned, the Nordic states to join Canada, which is part of the United Kingdom, the southern states, to Mexico, which since May 28, 1864, was ruled by Maximilian, the envoy of Napoleon III. Upon his arrival, Maximilian received immediately a loan of 200 million francs from the English Rothschild Bank. Capital agents work hard in the southern states to set up and embitter the population against the north, and to a large extent they succeed. They even offered the French the two states of Texas and Louisiana for material and military aid. Just when everyone these insidious plans are ready for action, the Russian emperor, watching closely these backstage games against the north, the United States, reports in Paris and London through its ambassadors, that any intervention by them against the north would be considered a declaration of war of Russia, and that, I will shoot at the first one who shoots at America. Alexander II immediately sent his Atlantic fleet led by the frigate, Weaknesses, in New York Bay, and the Pacific sent to San Francisco by explicit imperial order to placed above Lincoln's immediate command. The original orders to the two Russian admirals have been seen personally and are confirmed by the two American ambassadors A.D. Curtin and J.W. Lothrop, as well as Judge Field. The above is confirmed by Lincoln himself, as well as by Foreign Secretary W.H. Seward. This gesture of the Russian emperor saves the integrity of the United States of America, also helps them to be what they are today, but without any guarantee for tomorrow. This civil war, completely aimless and unnecessary to the American people, it takes a lot innocent victims. The North gives 385,245 killed and wounded, and the South 100,000 kill. It is worth noting that in the history of the Civil War in the United States nowhere mentions the above facts, and the American people behave in ignorance. That is why I claim again, as in the beginning, that world history must be rewritten from the real historians, not paid people to interested bankers, capitalists and politicians who own all the press, literature and even people. If the American people knew the truth about the Civil War, in no case would stand morally on the side of Japan in 1904-1905, when the two empires were at war. The reason why the Rothschilds and their 300 people want wars and clashes between nations is that wars are those that lead to large material obligations, and to them as dynasty bring incredible profits. That is why during the American Civil War Rothschild envoys are everywhere in all states. People oppose each other in the same way, as in Russia before the revolution. They are everywhere and do not serve Russia or the revolution. They carry out Trotsky's orders, the chosen one of Edward Rothschild. Lenin is being dealt with quickly, but underestimate Stalin. With today's astronomical obligations in which almost all countries in the world have fallen, the picture becomes clear everyone. There is no country that does not owe billions of dollars of foreign banks. Everyone is talking about foreigners' banks, and no one knows who they are. Everyone thinks all the loans and money come from America. She herself constantly distributes aid and loans to a world of billions of dollars. Many countries owe more 10 to 20 billion and are unable to pay even interest. The rulers are forced to resort to stagnation, negatively affect the affected people. What's going on in America, the country that lends almost all loans and money? She is herself owed more than $3 trillion. At the end of 1988, federal debt was $2,520 billion, of which only the interest is $154 billion, or 1/7 from the state budget. To make it clearer what $154 billion of interest, I will break them down during payments. These are $500 million a day, or $21 million an hour American taxpayers should pay the banks. It is only the federal obligation, which with the obligations of the private sector is more than $10 trillion, or $35,000 each American. To whom does America owe this fantastic amount, and who bought it? Do you know? The states, of course, those who own the money. No, I see how the United States could get out of this in a normal and legal way. The only way out is management, the state itself, to issue, print and control banknotes, and not to buy them from private banks, which in this case are the real ones, owners of the dollar. However, I do not see how this could happen. Happens because the octopus has firmly bound the state, and its numerous representatives are everywhere, from the presidency to the small municipality. For the American people, this is at lost cause. Rothschild's interests in Europe and the Western Hemisphere are large, but those in the Far East are no smaller. History shows how many wars Britain has waged to secure access to it. And all these wars are not only encouraged, but simply imposed on Britain with the riches of Rothschild. Without any justification, under pressure from the Rothschilds, Britain occupied Egypt and the Suez Canal fell under its control. The canal has been given to the UK for operation for a period for 99 years. But even after the end of the First World War in 1918 years, before the deadline 1969, the Rothschilds began to cut plans on how to secure the road to the Far East. Great Britain has squandered huge sums of money and spilled a lot of blood for control of the Suez Canal. One of the reasons for giving Palestine to the Jews is exactly this, the Middle East to be controlled by Zionism, the which the Rothschilds have full confidence in. They financed the relocation of 600,000 Jews from the East Europe and their settlement in Palestine. It began on May 18, 1948. At the expense of 1,350,000 defenseless Christians and Muslims who were expelled from their homes and lands. The creation of the State of Israel and today in general situation in the Middle East is due exclusively to the Rothschilds' efforts to ensure constant and secure access to the Far East. All the talk that God's chosen race must live in the land promised to them is only fabrication and justification. They know the tensions created in the Middle East have not led to one Third World War. The Rothschilds never came up with anything useful for humanity, has never created an industry like Ford and many others to give people jobs. From the beginning they start working with huge foreign capital, like all benefits keep to themselves. Behind all the world's difficulties and misfortunes, there are meanness and the frauds of the Rothschilds.